Hey guys, just a quick reminder that I have a 500 sub giveaway going on right now. If you look at the top of the screen, I got a link to that video as well as a link down in the description as well. So be sure to check it out for your chance to win an Aquamax LED light fixture. Hey everybody, Jay the Fish Guy here, back again for another episode of On the Road with the Fish Guy. Thanks for joining us. So today's episode, we're going to talk about moving your aquarium, and specifically I'll be talking about moving a reef tank, because that's the one that everybody seems to really be nervous about. Oh God, it's been set up, everything's doing great, I don't want to touch it, I can't move it. So that's one of the things I actually do pretty regular with my business, is helping folks move their aquariums, because there is quite a bit involved with it. It's pretty time consuming, pretty laborious. I don't mind doing it for sure, but I'm going to make this video today to just kind of go through the process, and for those that don't have access to someone like myself that can come and take care of it for you, maybe you'll feel a little more confident in tackling it yourself. So, moving a setup reef tank. It can definitely feel a little bit daunting, standing there looking at all the equipment, all your corals, your fish, the rock, the sand. You can sit there and just drive yourself crazy going, there's no way this is going to happen. It can. Have faith. So I have some footage that I'm going to play in the background here, a little bit there, of a tank move I did recently for a customer. He had one of the Red Sea reefer tanks. It was the 5-foot version. I don't remember what gallonage it was. But needless to say, a pretty good sized tank, had been established for less than a year, I think it was. And so that'll be going in the background here while I'm talking. So where do you start? Well, the minute that you pull the plug on the power for the setup, as far as your pumps, your heaters, your circulation, once you pull the plug, the countdown starts. You have a relatively limited amount of time before you have to get your fish and your corals back into a system and up and running again. Now, this timeline will vary depending on a few factors. A big one, obviously, is oxygenation of the water. So if you're not running battery-operated air pumps for, at the very least, your fish, that is going to cut down on the time that you have. So battery-operated air pumps, 5-gallon buckets, being able to run these, or if you have an inverter for your car and you plug in a standard air pump into that, that will work as well. But you want to have your fish oxygenated for sure. The next thing that comes into play is temperature. The warmer the water gets, the less oxygen it holds. Also, you will reach a threshold of the water being too warm, potentially, then you're causing issues with the fish and coral at that point, just simply due to temperature. The same goes for too cold. You really can't be doing this in the middle of winter, put your buckets of fish out in the car with no heat running, and then just hoping for the best for a few hours. They are going to chill down extremely quickly. So summertime, if you have the ability to run any kind of air conditioning in your vehicle, that would be a plus. Don't put them outside in the car if there's no air conditioning until the very last minute, until you're ready to go and drive to their new location. So temperature is critical. So what does that all break down to? Well, if you have stable temps and you have oxygenation, easily you could do this in 8 to 12 hours and still feel confident that your fish aren't going to get stressed out. If you have to go literally out of state and you're going for a long distance trip that'll take days, literally, it is still possible. But beyond the temperature and oxygenation concerns, you will want to have at least a couple of buckets of freshly made salt water that parameters match to the water that the fish are in terms of temperature, salinity, things like that. That you'll be able to swap out the water and essentially do a water change on the bucket while you're traveling. So if you do a 50 to 75% water change on the buckets once a day, that will buy you more time. Obviously, the less fish you have in the bucket, the longer it can go. So if you're cramming an entire tank full of fish into one bucket, expect to have to clean that potentially multiple times a day. So there's your timeline. Usually most of my moves are from one place in New Hampshire to another. So I'm generally not driving much farther than an hour to 2 hours. So that makes it a little bit more friendly. But the entire process generally takes 6 to 8 hours by the time you take into account breaking everything down, packaging everything up, moving it, and then setting it back up. So there's your timeline. So where do we start with all this? All right, so we've killed the power. Right. Now you need to start disassembling all the equipment. This is a great time to also quickly clean everything. If you have an extra set of hands and somebody that can, take direction well, they don't even have to know about what they're playing with, as long as you can hand them a skimmer cup and go, hey, can you clean this? Or even better, if you have a fellow reef hobbyist as a friend, you can hand them a pump and be like, hey, while this is apart, can you go clean the pump for me before you put it all into buckets, totes, whatever, to carry to the next place. So cleaning everything while you're doing this is a great idea. Do you have a bunch of nastiness in your sump that hasn't been touched in a while that needs to get addressed? Now's the time to do it. So things like that, pumps, power heads, heaters, overflows, various areas of your sump, refugium, whatever. Take the time to clean it as you're disassembling and taking it all apart. Be mindful of power bricks for pumps. You don't want those things to get soggy in a bucket. If you're just throwing everything in a bucket and you forget and you throw the cord and the power brick and everything in there too, and then that thing gets douched with salt water, probably not the best for it. So make sure to remove power bricks, and if they're not labeled, taking the moment to label them. If you have a few different ones, they may be different outputs, so you don't want to confuse those power bricks up and put them on the wrong piece of equipment. So that's a great tip to keep in mind as everything's coming apart as well. So you've disassembled all the equipment, you've gotten that all taken care of. Now you need to start removing everything from the tank. So before you get ahead of yourself and before you start disturbing rock structures and sand beds and everything else, the best way to go about doing this is remove as much water as you can that you're going to save before you touch anything. So you want clean, clear water. As soon as you start moving rocks, and especially rocks that are touching the sand bed, it's game over. All the water at that point is just going to be munged up to a point that you don't want to put fish in it. You definitely not want to reuse it. It's just not really going to be possible. So if you have water ready-made at the new location, and a lot of times I'll suggest for the client to have at least 50% of the system volume new, ready to go at the new location. The idea behind this is you are going to lose some water. There's going to be junk water that has to be discarded, not only from the tank, but from inside the sump, the skimmer, all the parts of your system, overflows, everything that's just dirty, nasty, you're going to lose a fair amount of water. So having that 50% cushion is a great idea. So you've saved out good water, you've removed fish, you've removed coral, you got them in buckets or totes, got your air pumps running. They can be put to one side. If temperature is a factor, you keep them in the house and stable for as long as possible. And then you move on to the rock. As long as the rock doesn't have any coral attached to it still, like sometimes you get larger chunks of SPS that have attached themselves to a large chunk of rock, or any coral for that matter. If there's corals attached to the rock and you can't get them off, that rock obviously needs to be submerged. Beyond that, your live rock can be in a tote or a bucket with just a little bit of water, just so it keeps moist and humid in there. And it'll be good for the entire trip without having to add more water or to mess with it. The live rock will still be alive. You know, biologically alive is what we're shooting for here, if it doesn't have any corals or anything left on it. So getting those all bucketed and, you know, in totes or whatever you're going to do, that'll be your next step. If you have a sand bed and you plan on keeping your sand bed, even if the tank has only been set up for less than a year, there is a very good possibility that that sand bed, especially underneath where you have your rock structure, is going to be extremely nasty. So keeping maybe as much as 25-30% of the water in the tank after you've taken everything else out, and then gravel vacuuming as much of the sand as possible before you attempt to move it. Because if you just simply leave it in there and then you move it into the next next location and you're dumping all your water back in, you are going to stir up all kinds of just nastiness, and your tank is going to be that much longer before it's back on its feet. So, you know, I personally, I like going bare bottom with a lot of tanks. You know, unless it's a nano tank, typically I end up doing a bare bottom. And this particular move that I did that we're showing here in the background, I actually was talking with the owner for a little bit, and, you know, the pros and cons of, you know, sand bed, no sand bed. And then I showed him what his sand bed looked like as we were moving stuff around at the very end before we packed up. And he's like, oh, yeah, why don't we just go ahead and pull that out? So we ended up ditching the sand bed at that point. But if you're not going to ditch it and you are going to keep it, gravel vacuuming as much as you can while it's in the tank and you have some water left in there is probably going to be your best bet. You know, you can rinse it, but if you're going to be rinsing it in a bucket with a hose and fresh water, you're going to kill a lot of the beneficial biological and even some critters that are left in there. So, you know, that's kind of at your own risk kind of deal if you feel that you want to do that. You know, it's also a time if you felt that you wanted to just simply do a new sand bed. Like you like the idea of a sand bed, but it's been in there so long, just so nasty, you don't want to deal with it. Putting in a new sand bed at this time is a great way to go as well. So that's always an option. All right, so we've packed everything up. You know, we've saved our rock, our coral, our fish. Everything's, you know, packaged up for the ride. And now it comes down to picking up the tank and moving it. And for these larger tanks, that's sometimes easier said than done. These Red Sea Max tanks are actually pretty hefty. They use some good glass. Any bigger tank, usually for anything 6 foot or above, in terms of like a 180, it's a really good idea to have at least 2 friends to help you. If you have some difficult stairs or corners to navigate, 1 body per corner is a good a good rule of thumb. You know, this 180 that I just did recently for my own personal tank, it was myself and a good friend Drew that I usually call on for tank moves. Between the two of us, we can usually power through, and we got the 180 out of the old place onto the trailer into my new place. And it was easy because we only had small sets of stairs. If we had to do any large stairs, or if we had corners to navigate, that 180 probably would have been too much, or just simply too much of a risk. You know, you don't want to risk yourself as far as harm, and you definitely don't want to go bouncing off your walls or furniture or anything like that. You know, the bigger tanks definitely are heavy, so keep that in mind. This the Red Sea Max, this 5-foot tank, it was probably weighed as much as a 125, maybe a 150. So even though it's only 5 foot, because of the construction, it was still weighed in. So definitely be careful, you know, plan ahead, have a friend or two there with you, and just be safe, basically. And that's really the hard part, is breaking everything down, taking the time to do it properly in the correct order, and then getting it loaded up. That's what I consider the hard part. Once you get past that, everything's downhill from there. You know, you make it to your new location safe and sound, and get it in the house. Make sure to level the tank. That's sometimes people forget that when they're coming into a new house. They just maybe assume that everything's ready to go. They get it close to almost full, and they're like, oh, wait, the water line's like at an angle. What am I doing here? So that's not the time to level your tank. Throw a good a level on there. before you start putting water in. So level the tank, put your sand bed back in if you're going to keep your sand bed. Start building your rock structure, maybe just the first level or two. And then if you're dumping water back in, dump it on top of the rock that you've placed in, as to not stir up the sand bed any more than you have to. And ideally, I mean, the setup that I use, I have a small Rio pump with a length of 3/4 tubing, and then an output nozzle on the end of that. So what I'll do is I'll just put that pump in a bucket, pump it up and over the side of the tank and in, and it looks like the output of a canister filter. So I can point that nozzle wherever I want. It goes in slow and easy, doesn't stir up the sand bed more than it has to, and it goes pretty quick, just bucket to bucket to bucket, or if you're using totes, you know, it's very, very friendly to get all that water in and not have to heave 5-gallon buckets up and over and dump in and water going everywhere. But if you don't have it, well, just slow and steady. So you get all your water back in there, get all your equipment back set up, you know, fill the tank up, fill the sump up if you have a sump, and just start plugging everything back in. Get your circulation pumps going, your skimmer going. You know, again, your fish are on the clock, so the sooner you can get it in place, leveled, filled, and running, the better. Get the fish back in the tank, get the corals back in the tank. Don't worry too much about your final rock placement or your final coral placement. Odds are the tank's going to be a little bit hazy. It's not going to be all that clear. Some moves I've done, I've literally had to build the rock structure blind because I couldn't see what was in there. But you know, that clears up fairly quickly as long as you have a filter sock or some form of mechanical filtration. Generally overnight, you know, by the next day, things have cleared up to a point where you can put the rocks where they're going to be, put your corals where they're going to be. Just that first day, do it safely. Just make sure you're not going to tumble the rock structure and crush a fish or a coral. And it doesn't even matter where the corals are. You know, you might have some highlight demanding corals. Overnight, it's not going to matter. You know, they're going to be pissed off for easily a few days. So you're not really going to have to worry about it much. And then the next day you can get everything finalized and put into place. And then, you know, don't expect the corals to bounce back immediately. You know, that's pretty traumatic for them. As much as a week, they might still be irritated and not out and looking their best. But once they get settled, and, you know, try to mimic as close as possible to your flow patterns as you had before, and the same as far as placing them roughly in the same position as far as light and flow goes, and that'll get them back on track that much quicker. If you can't, well, you know, you got to do what you got to do. If you decided to have a new design with your rock structure, you know, that's a good time to do it, but it makes it sometimes a little bit difficult to put them back in the same place, and that's fine. Just, again, don't expect them to be ready to go and perfectly happy right away. So that pretty much wraps it up for today, guys. Hopefully you'll feel a little bit more confident if you have to tackle a tank move. This one ran a little bit long. I think we're pushing almost 20 minutes. You know, I tried to condense as much as possible while touching on the major points. If you have any questions beyond what I've covered in this, don't hesitate to leave me a comment down in the comment section below, and I'll get things answered for you. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.